Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we'll be talking about distance, which seems appropriate with this machete I forged because it's short enough that I hopefully won't break the light fittings in the furniture in the process. So, in terms of distance, I mean the concept is really simple. I can't cut the camera in half right now because I'm too far away. I can touch this table because I'm close enough. Really simple. But the actual tactics around that, regarding close combat of any sort really, get more complicated than that. So, one of the first things we should bear in mind is different targets. So when you're fencing an opponent, a lot of people, especially beginners, tend to forget this, but there are different targets of the opponent which require different distances. So one of the things I've noticed myself, lacking confidence to close distance sometimes, is that one of my favourite targets is around the hands and the forearms. Because if you time this right, and bearing in mind distance and timing are very interlinked at times, one of the things that you should bear in mind is that an opponent doing something like an attack with their weapon will create usually an opening with their hands and their forearms first. Second place, it depends on how they're leaning, but it'll either be their head or their legs. So different opponents will fight in different ways. You're generally recommended, well at least in what I do when you're looking at things like British military sabre, German and Italian longsword, medieval treatises and those sorts of things of historical European martial arts, it's generally recommended that you try to stay upright. There are instances where, it's not like you're guaranteed to die if you lean, but the big problem is when you do so, it often exposes your head. So if I'm doing something like some sort of lunge, I can get a lot of distance stretching out of the legs, but yet if I lean so much with my head, it can get to the point where, actually as you can see, if you see as I'm leaning here, with my legs, notice this head that I don't want to get injured. It can be worth lots of points in a tournament, or can lead to a fatality or a severe concussion in a real fight. With this, you can see as I lean further and further and further, my head is still staying just as far away from where I can reach with my weapon. Now this can apply with a two-handed weapon, maybe a polearm like a spear, one-handed weapon like a machete or a sword, even if you're not actually using it forward in a sort of sabre style and you're starting more on that medieval, I'm back here because I've not got hand protection. Regardless, you're not sticking that head as far forwards. Whereas, if you lean forwards, notice here, I'll extend my arm for the reach, notice what happens with regards to how close my head is. As I do this, instead of my shoulder being here, and my head being just behind it, now I've put my head in front of my shoulders. So although there are different ways in which I can gain extra reach, with regards to the footwork and the body movement, if I lean forwards, this actually puts my head much more in measure to be hit. If I lean more using my legs and stay upright, I've got a lot more of my arm reach in front of my head. So in terms of how far you can reach in the end, that wildly depends, because you'll be moving around, your opponent's moving, you might have mismatched weapons, all sorts of factors involved. But in terms of how you reach for your body, which you don't want injured, compared to your weapon, which is the threat that the opponent has to deal with, if I'm doing things like this, I'm putting my body closer to my weapon. It's almost the same as closing to my opponent like this. However, it's okay to close to your opponent with your weapon retracted, because you've still got that opportunity. If I've put my arms back, there's no trouble putting them back forwards again. And indeed the arms are designed to be quite fast. This time of the hand, I think I've heard it called before. Whereas with the body, if you overcommit and you've got your body weight leaning forwards, trying to recover is often slower. It doesn't matter how much fitness you've got, whether you're someone who's somewhat out of shape like me, whether you're someone who is really, you know, absolutely ripped with muscles, everything's lightning fast, regardless, your ability to move with your hand is going to be much faster than your ability to move bending your torso, just inherently by the human body's design. It's not really designed for you to be doing this all day. This is not legit fighting. This is. So always bear that in mind. I'd recommend, hence, that you can lean your head in sometimes. There are reasons to do so, because obviously the extra reach at a particular moment can help. But in general, try to refrain from doing anything that leans your body forward, unless you have to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you have different targets. Like I mentioned already, you have things like the hands, forearms. So one of the things you can do is, if you're up against an opponent and you're not very confident that you could hit, let's say, the head. So maybe I'm going to, the opponent swings in with their sword, I parry, riposte to the head, cut it open. Maybe I think, the opponent's maybe so quick that I'm worried that maybe I'll try to defend and then they'll just change angles and hit me quickly. One of the advantages of choosing your targets and playing with distance is that you can actually choose something like the arms instead. So one of the things, and I'll admit it's one of my bad habits sometimes, that I pick shallow targets. So if an opponent's, even if they're more retracted, but applying especially so if they stick their arms forward a lot, you can just simply cut at the forearms and the hands. And it's one of the situations where you can end up hitting the opponent whilst they feel like they can't hit you. And it's been an interesting situation. This has happened against people who are less experienced and sometimes against people who are more experienced. I've found that despite being shorter, and of course in tournaments and sparring, me and my opponents are using very similar weapons, whatever they are, almost identical, I've been able to hit the opponent that's taller than me and thus should reach further than me, but yet they did not hit me. And this was due to my preference for those shallow targets, whilst keeping my shallow targets out of the way if possible. So let's say I'm here in sort of sabre in the inside and outside guards, and we're just playing around, and I often like to do it in a lazy form, firstly because I get a bit tired sticking my arm out, but also because I don't really want to be presenting these targets, so I keep it more retracted. So my opponent might be playing around and trying to get in close, and they're thinking they need to be at least an extra step or so that I can go BAM! And hit towards their torso or their head. But then before they know it, I cut their arm and get out of the way. This is because if your opponent sticks their arms forward, prime target. So that's another thing to bear in mind. And the same can apply to the legs as well. Like I mentioned earlier, depending on how your opponents fight in individual contexts, if they are someone who stays more upright, then they might well end up, especially in certain lunges, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but my knees are sticking a lot more further forward than my head. I mean, it's good, I'd rather have my legs cut than my head, side note, but it means that if the opponent is like that, and their leg is forward, that means I can cut at their legs without having to overreach quite as far as to reach their head or torso. Likewise, let's say they're that kind of person who wants to maybe, I see this a lot when people cut, not so much when they're cutting forwards at the head or the torso or the arms, but more when they're aiming for the legs. They'll kind of do a bit of both. They'll lead forwards with their legs and they'll bend their body forwards as well. And what it means is that their head sticks forward quite a distance, and it means for the same distance you can hit their head very easily. And you can play with this distance yourself. I've seen it in a lot of sabre treatises, and in the British military sabre that I know, it is called position 1. And I covered this in the guards, but you just simply close the heels together. And what this does is it's just one of many ways to play with distance. So let's say you have a foolish opponent who's leaning with their body and is trying to chop down at your legs. They've been leaning with their legs, and their body, and then with their arms. So they've put a lot of their own body forwards, and of course they are in doing so trying to extend that sword forwards dangerously towards you. While they're doing that, if I close my legs, notice if you look at my body more than my legs, how much have I changed in terms of distance? I'm roughly in the same spot. If I've extended my legs out, yes, especially if I have forward weighted, which I don't think you really should do. If I've done that, then yes, I've lost some distance. But the amount that my leg has retracted is significantly more than that. So it's this thing, again, complicated with the distance. My distance in terms of how far my arm and my sword can reach hasn't really lost much. But my leg, in how far the opponent has to now gain, is a lot more. And this is why it's easy to do things like strike at their head or their arms while they're trying to cut your legs open. Because I've done an action which takes my legs that much away, but yet takes my own reach that much away. And yet it's just simply because I know, in this case, if maybe the opponent's telegraphed it in some way, or you've made a last-minute reaction, you've taken that away from the opponent, so they need a lot more reaching. They might adapt. I have seen situations where I've closed the legs together, unfortunately they've still hit me. But in doing so, they've seen it and they've adapted by reaching further and further and further with their body, that it means that while previously I might have been able to just swing and barely miss, instead, solid hit. For the very reasons I just stated. They're having to reach a lot further, and I've only lost a little bit of distance. So then it's a net gain, now we're almost talking accounting, a net gain for my reach compared to theirs. So it's always worth bearing in mind that kind of stuff when you're fighting an opponent. The way you position your body and the things that you do will help. And another example is because certain people like myself have a nasty habit of targeting those shallow targets, especially, very especially, the arms and forearms. One of the things you can do to counter that, I don't know why I'm giving everyone tips in how to fight me, but there we go. If you see that someone like myself is targeting the hands and forearms a lot, one of the things you can do is take that target away. So if I'm extending out, maybe I'm cutting forwards and all of this is going on, and maybe the arms going out forwards, and here's this target, and I see an opponent cutting towards me and they seem to like hitting my hands a lot, I just take my hands away. There are lots of ready positions, so if we look at one-handed swords again, there are positions like back here, this applies with two hands, up here, can do it with two hands, back here, lots of different positions where you can be either close to your body or slightly behind the body, maybe raised aloft, maybe lower, maybe quite far back, maybe next to you, whatever. Those are covered when you look at different guards and stances, which I've covered in other videos. But it means that this target, something that bleeds, comes away. Well, yet, of course, although it does affect your timing, because being out here, that's a nice, easy cut. You can do something like a wrist cut, and I know it works because I've done test cutting, and you can still put a fair amount of heft, especially if you've got a longer weapon, it's got a faster moving tip. You do this. It's a faster cut than going from back here to do the same cut. So there's short cut and a long cut. So that's why someone might stick their arm forward, but when we go back to distance, of course, this extra part that can bleed is an advantage to the opponent sometimes. So taking that away from them means they have to reach further to actually hit you. At all times, you will need to find an instance where you are extending your weapon again, whether it's to thrust or to cut or to beat the opponent, whatever it is you're doing in offense or defense. You will need to put your arms forward to do some kind of attack or defense at some point. But if you spend most of your time, when that clash hasn't happened, passively while you're still getting into distance. If you're keeping your arms and your legs out of the way, it means the opponent has to commit more to try and chop at you. And it means that they're more likely to target the torso and the head, because, nobody really keeps targeting, your arms if they can, for the same reach, hit you in the head, unless you accidentally put it in the way. But, although they might still hit your legs, bear in mind, it's one of the strange things. There are some opponents who still, with the same distance, will decide to hit your legs because they think it's sneakier, even though you're just going to chop on their head. Side note. But, yeah, it's something to bear in mind, and I know I've been rambling, but I'm hoping that you've learned something from this. So, when it comes to these sorts of things, that's basically it, actually. So yeah, use your body, use your distance, and use your weapon. Now, to counter the Doughnut of Death, that's something I haven't covered yet. So, when you've got that distance where someone taller, with a bigger weapon, or whatever, can't seem to, be defeated because they're able to hit you. And I remember one time at fight camp, there was a person who was nearly 7 feet tall, and they were just doing this. Legs close together, leaning forwards, chop, 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 chop. That was it. And yet, the people facing them were struggling because that opponent was extremely tall. But what happened in the end was the people who won would charge in. And the main way to do this is either with a covered attack or with a parry riposte. So, in the case of something like if you're doing sword and shield, sword and buckler, or in some instances if you're used to certain thwarting strikes and clever techniques with things like, single weapons, you can defend yourself while attacking. One example of this would be, well, I'll cover that in another video, but we'll call it the Sinister Window, which is a left side, or at least non-dominant side, window guard from Fury, and then thrusting out from there. So if you know a person's cutting this way, you're covering that side with your blade and the cross guard, whilst you can charge in and extend out for a thrust. Or one of my favourites is an inside guard for sabre, parry riposte. So I know the opponent's cutting like this, or like this, so I think, alright, I'll just charge in, I'll close the distance, bam, bam. It's as simple as that. But another thing you can do is, if you've got something like a buckler, a shield, large shield, or even a second weapon. This can work in things like rapier and dagger, dual swords, things like that. You can use one of the weapons to defend and one of the weapons to attack. But rather than doing it separately, do it at once. You've got two separate items, so why not use them simultaneously? You don't have to, an opponent's, let's say, cutting this way again, you don't have to go ding and put everything in a way. You can go ding cut, or rather, one action. So with that sort of thing, that's what I mean when I say a covered attack. Same sort of thing with something like a buckler. When I look at things like the I-33 treatise, there seems to be a lot of, when you're attacking forwards, you're not doing this and pulling the shield away. You're actually putting the shield forward as you're attacking. It's that same kind of thing. So you're allowing yourself not to die when the opponent's in their optimal range, where they can hit you and you can't hit them. You expect that attack and, thwart it in some way. And then, of course, you're able to counter in. It again depends on your opponent's reach. A single time attack, or single time counter rather, where you're parrying and attacking like that left window, catch as you stab type of thing. That, if you're against someone who has a lot more reach than you, of course, that's going to take some time. You're either having to do that as you're charging in, and there's a bit of a delay still between the defend and the attack. Or you just, if you have that situation, you just knowingly do it in a 2-time counter. Parry, riposte. So that, I have found, helps me a lot, and it did help me quite a lot against this person when I was doing the Wessex League tournament, because like I said, I'm quite short, so I'm up against opponents who usually can attack, but I can't really attack them. I'd just be swinging at the air uselessly, and they're not stupid, they're decent quality fighters, so if they see me swinging and I'm out of measure, it's not even going to work as a feint. They'll just do nothing, because they know that, just like if I was going to try to chop this camera in half, why didn't you flinch behind your screen? Well, firstly because you know it's in a screen, but secondly because I'm too far away. So trying all this stuff out of measure doesn't help. So what I would do is I would simply go into measure, see if I could get something like, admittedly usually arm cuts and things, shallow targets, to try and trick them into thinking they're too far away and I can't hit them, and then, haha, yes I can. Or I would try a deeper target like the head, and it would be, okay, I'll force them, they seem to be maybe up here, so they'll probably go from high, alright, let's try it out, parry, riposte. So then I'm countering what they're probably doing, and then closing into my range and giving them something. So apart from that, I did touch on something which is another point to do with distance, which I'll go over finally, and that is the feint. So like I said, any opponent who's got more than a couple of brain cells to spare and has some experience in fighting, if they see you doing kind of this, they won't react. And the reason is because by the time someone's got a bit of experience in fighting, they have a rough idea of how far the weapon reaches. You can deceive that. There are ways to do that, by concealing the weapon, trying to get the weapon's point in line with their eyes, and try and do it so that, you know, if I do this, you can see how long this machete is. If I do this, you have a much harder time figuring out how long my machete is, that sort of thing. Or, you know, like this, you'll have a hard time figuring out how long the machete is. But apart from that, doing this, it never works. You can feint, and it's a valid tactic. In fact, it's a very good tactic to learn. I recommend it for everybody. But never feint. It's a difficult one, because on the one hand, you shouldn't really feint completely out of measure, because you can pretend, you know, you could stamp your feet, you can give a really quick attack, you can put your arms and your body into it so you look absolutely menacing. You can give this, I'm giving a powerful attack, you better defend it, and that speed that means, oh, panic, you know, this is something happening suddenly, and then maybe some sort of, I've seen people do a stomp that makes a loud noise, and it's that sort of thing to try and panic the opponent, or even doing that when they don't panic to give them a false sense of confidence, so that eventually, now the real attack happens, and they go, oh, what? The problem is, if you're doing all of that outside of measure, the further away you do it, the less effective feinting is. So if I do a feint, and I'm doing all this, and I'm miles away, honestly, the opponent just does not care. And it happens, I've seen it around me as well. I've seen some people, newer fighters, who've tried feinting, and they've tried this kind of boom, boom, oh, look, oh, what's this, oh. And I'm just completely, I don't even move, in fact. It's one of my ways to teach them, and I often just go, because I'm trying to teach, you know, I try to, when I'm sparring with people who are new, I try to sort of, not just, you know, show who's best and all this crap. I try to show them the things that are working with them and, you know, what's not working against me. And, you know, if they're feinting out of distance, I'll just be there, I'll shrug my shoulders and go, you know, because it's not doing anything, to make them realise, oh, he realises that, you know, I'm trying this pretending he knows I'm too far away, so he's ignoring it. So they have, if you want to do a feint, you need to pressure the opponent. So that means you need to either look like you're getting into distance, which can be with some sort of sudden movement, you know, with your body closing into range, but maybe not quite into range. It can mean getting slightly into range, so that they actually realise they have to react. But maybe you're playing, again, it's all about playing with the distance. If your opponent, if you get into range, there is always that risk that you're going to be hit, especially again if the opponent has more reach than you. But if you get into that range, your opponent is more on edge. They actually have to do something. If you do a feint, but it's in a distance where you can hit them, I mean, you can have an opponent like myself who relies a bit too much on parry riposte actions. So against that, if you're doing this and you pretend to cut from above, let's say your plan is, I'll pretend to cut from above and then I'll cut from below. It's a valid tactic. But if you're doing this from miles away, this has no effect. And then by the time you're doing it for real, there's such a difference between them that it actually becomes very easy to spot the pretend and real attacks, because they just look so different when you're doing it out of distance comfortably and in distance uncomfortably, and it makes the whole thing fall apart. So with that feint, doing it in distance, if you can do it and maybe quickly retract, or you're doing that feint, maybe giving them a false sense of confidence, or trying to make them panic into doing, defending the wrong thing, like above instead of below, that needs to happen in distance. Oh, apologies for that fan. But, yeah, that's that for today. I think I'll wrap this up. I've waffled on for a bit too long. I hope you learned something, and see you next time. Remember, I'm the Genie for a reason. If you ask for a topic to be discussed, I will talk about it in another video. Ask and you shall receive. So, goodbye.